Welcome again to High Wycombe Paranormal Meetup Group, and we are in the month of May, and obviously it's the sun's coming out now and everyone wants to get out of their skull in the summer months, but this is the thing, we're not going to get out of our skull, we're actually going to get into a skull, because Andrew's going to be talking about the Starchild skull, as you can see images of it here, there. Without further ado then, I'll say I'll hand it straight over to Andrew. We'll do our usual thing, we're going to talk for a bit, we'll take a break maybe when it suits Andrew, and then we'll come back and maybe Andrew does a part two, we'll take questions and we'll take it from there and we'll do the collection at the end. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Neil. Thanks for inviting me again. Thank you. Thanks to everyone for coming in, particularly those that have come a long way. And what I'll do is just get straight into it. You can see what we're going to be looking at tonight. I did mean to bring my replica, but I came out in a bit of a hurry, so I forgot to bring my replica. I have got a replica of the skull that you're going to hear about tonight. All of this information is on my website and on the starchildproject.com website, but I've got some details about this at the end, which I'm going to leave to the end, because something very strange has just happened, basically. I've got a couple of booklets here on the table, just ordinary A4 paper folded in half, which I made, which have got the salient information from tonight's presentation, but it is basically all on the internet. I haven't really got that much new information except what happened last week that I'm going to tell you about. So here we go. This was research which was originally coordinated and collected by Lloyd Pye. Now, basically the story with this is that I got to know Lloyd Pye starting in 2003. I was looking into Disclosure Project, which was all to do with the UFO disclosure and crashed UFOs and this sort of thing. And I came across this Starchild skull soon after I first got broadband internet, which was way back in 2003. Wrote to Lloyd Pye, said, this is really interesting. And he said, I'm coming to the UK. I said, when? He said, next week or something. And I met him early in 2004. And I went down to London to a lady called Belinda Mackenzie, who comes into this presentation later. I could do a whole presentation about her. She introduced us. I helped Lloyd transfer some 35mm slides into PowerPoint, because in 2004 he wasn't using PowerPoint, as of course I am now, and just about everybody is now. So I had a scanner that scanned transparencies, and I put them into PowerPoint for him. And he was going like, oh, this is just unbelievable. Oh, you're such a... Oh, you've been sent by God, he says, or something. No, just get on with it. Get out with it, you know. It's just PowerPoint. Come on, man. And he's a lovely guy. Lovely, lovely guy. Nicest guy in the world. And he shared the same sort of frustration as I did, in that we got this evidence, which you're going to see tonight. Extremely compelling. I'd say proof. And nobody wanted to listen to it. Nobody wanted to listen to it. And how many people are here tonight? You know, it is difficult to promote these events, though. So who am I? Few people in the room, probably most people in the room already know me. I currently work part-time for the Open University. I work as a tutor. I was doing study needs assessments, but that essentially came to an abrupt halt a few weeks ago. I had a UFO sighting when I was 10 years old, sort of light going off into the distance, didn't know what that was. Always been interested in stuff like that. I got ghost books, Aidan Chambers books, Loch Ness Monster, Dictionary of Monsters and Mysterious Beasts, all that stuff when I was about 12. This is a picture at my brother's graduation. I didn't want to reveal my brother's identity, but you could easily find out who he was. And that's at Durham. He went to Durham University and he was actually taught by David Bellamy. So I then went through ordinary school. I went to Ermysted's Grammar School in Skipton, a school which was founded in 1492, as they told us every week. A rugby school, and you can see I'm built for rugby, as you can see. So I love that, of course. And then I went to Lancaster University, did a degree in computer science and physics, which of course means that I'm a computer nerd, which is what I am. And then, yeah, I got the replica school, well, that was 2014, skipping ahead. I helped Lloyd organise talks, a couple of talks, not a lot. We had one in Nottingham, which was 2009, and we had one in Derby in 2012. And I also took him to Radio Leeds in 2009 as well, when he was over in the UK then. And I stayed in regular contact with Lloyd until his death in 2013. He died of lymphoma cancer, which was it's horrible. It's horrible. But we'll maybe mention a bit more about that. So what about this skull then? You've heard enough about me, or maybe even too much. But we're going to look at the so-called Starchild skull. But this has turned out to be something of an inappropriate name. It is similar to a human skull, with all 8 of the major human components evident frontal bone, 2 sphenoids, 2 temporals, 2 parietals, and an occipital. Those are the major bones of the human skull. However, each component is profoundly redesigned, with the bone itself astonishingly reconstituted into something uniformly half as thick as a normal human bone, weighing half as much as a normal skull. It's 30 points of reference on it, and compare them to the average same 30 points on 100 normal skulls. The results fall 10 standard deviations from the statistical norm in terms of measurements, where features are, sizes of things, and so forth. We're going to cover tonight, we're going to look at the history of the skull, where it came from, or where it's alleged to have come from, basic physical differences, some of which you can sort of see here just by quick inspection, some of which are much less obvious. X-ray analysis, we've got some X-ray pictures that were taken in 1999. Dental analysis, skepticism and debunking attempts. We were debating before we came here tonight whether there were going to be any skeptics from the skeptics in the pub group, or as I prefer to call them, liars in the pub, which is what most of them are, but that's a different story. We will then look at DNA analysis, which has been done on this, which is one of the questions that comes up. We're going to mention a couple of other skulls, and then summary and conclusions, and also cover what's happened very recently in the last week or so. Now, this book, if you go onto the internet, you'll probably find this book. And in fact, we had another chap came to speak here 2 or 3 months ago, 4 or 5 months ago, even maybe by now, and he talked about the skull. I know him, Alan Foster is his name, and I've met him a few times. He's a nice chap. He came out with this human-alien hybrid thing, which I'll get onto, but this book is basically out of date. So if you find this book, it's a good book, it's accurate, but it's out of date. New information was discovered, particularly since 2010, so this is kind of out of date, but it's still a worthwhile read. Only contains the research up to 2007. The Starchild skull itself, as I say, it's a real bone skull, and the owners are Ray and Melanie Young, and we're going to get onto this more at the end as well. And they live in El Paso, Texas. So, to my knowledge, the skull is somewhere in a bank vault in El Paso, Texas, or maybe somewhere else now, I'm not sure. But up until very recent times, it was, I think, in a bank vault or in their house in El Paso, Texas. Now, the skulls were given to Ray and Melanie Young in 1998, and what you're seeing here is actually a human skull and the Starchild skull. I've got a clip of this later, so you'll actually see this clip, which is an important clip. And basically what happened was the skull was found in 1930 in Mexico, in the Copper Canyon area, which is about 100 miles southwest of Chihuahua, and it was found by a teenage girl who went exploring in a mine tunnel. And there were caves and mine tunnels in the area, and she went into this cave. She found a half-buried skeleton. In fact, she found 2 half-buried skeletons, and there was a human-looking skeleton which had its arm around another skeleton which didn't quite look human. It looked a lot smaller, about 4 feet long, and it had a strange skull. The girl gathered up the bones in the basket. She knew that she wasn't supposed to be there. She knew she wasn't supposed to have these skulls, and then she basically hid them, and then there was a rainstorm, came back, and only the 2 skulls were left. The rest of the bones had been washed away, and she took these bones back with her. Somehow she managed to hide them, and she kept them for the whole of her life. And roundabout, in fact, yeah, so this is the story here. This is the area that it looks like. This is what it looks like. This is a typical sort of mining cave. Some people live in there now. So this is the sort of area, this is sort of the landscape that it was found in. And so these skulls she kept, as I say, throughout her life. Around about 1992, she was nearly dying, and she gave these to a friend. The friend didn't like having the skulls. There was a human skull and a non-human looking skull, and then they passed this on to another friend who was an FBI agent, and the FBI agent knew Melanie Young, and she knew that she was a neonatal nurse, and she had expertise in basic anatomy, so she was given the skulls, and then she knew that they were unusual. Immediately she looked at them, she knew, this is really weird, I've never seen anything like this. And one of the things you're going to see if you look carefully on the Starchild skulls at right hand, I'll point this out in a couple of minutes, it's got this staining on the skull, and this staining matches with the story in that it was in this loosely compacted earth in this cave, and the staining has come from the sand or the soil or the oxidised soil that it was half buried in. So the story that we were given matches what is shown on the skull, at least in part. So just a quick look at the skull with the human skull at the top and the so-called Starchild, which again is sort of not necessarily a good name for it, on the bottom, but we'll come to all of this. And just a quick look there. I mean, this is perhaps the immediately most striking image, but then you can see you've got the same bones. We're going to go through all this in detail, but you can see the shape is completely different. That to me is again also extremely different. It looks like an apple. It reminds me of looking at an apple, but this is of course from the top view, and this has been tilted forward slightly. Totally different. Totally different. So let's just take a little bit more detailed view at each of those views that we saw, and others as well. On the left, we're always going to have the human female, which was found with it, so it's a good point of reference, and the Starchild skull. Both size of the small adult or 12-year-old, the Starchild skull has no brow ridges. These little lumps, which are at the top of your eyebrows here, you've got these slight ridges. Starchild doesn't have those. That's very unusual. That's the first thing. And there's no dip from the brow to the nose, so you've got a little dip in here. The Starchild doesn't have that. Nose widths are equal, so about the same as humans. Eye sockets are only half an inch deep. That's a big one. The Starchild are 2 inches deep. We're going to come back to that, another picture of that as well. Now the Starchild's cheeks had been snapped off in a way which is improbable in a human. So this damage here wouldn't normally happen to a human skull. And we can see that the chewing muscles, they're also in a different place. I've got these again on later slides. And the skull has been carbon dated twice, and it's 900 years old, plus or minus 40 years in both attempts at dating the skull. So yes, we know that it was living round about 900 years ago. So a bit more detail of some of the bones here. And we can see that the human skull has had a concussion here. It's not so clear on the screen, but basically you can see these little cracks in this area, and that indicates that there was a blunt impact causing a concussion there. And then the other thing which is most obvious here is this missing inion, and you can feel you've got a little lump at the back of your head there. You'll feel like there's this little lump sticking out. That's your inion. Starchild doesn't have one. Again, extremely unusual for that to be missing. Same parts: frontal, sphenoid, temporal, parietal. Then the concussion there. The other one that was found early on, without any obvious sort of complicated testing with X-rays or anything, is that the human female has 1200 cc brain, 1200 millilitres. Starchild, even though it looks smaller on the outside, 1600, which is, obviously 33% bigger. So you imagine somebody having a 33% bigger brain than you. And it's also, the brain cavity is angled steeply down onto the cerebellum base, and which is a quarter to the third of the normal size. So you'll see the hole at the base of the skull is much smaller than with a human. Reduced cerebellum lower brain has greatly reduced internal struts to support a much greater volume of cerebrum brain. Now what that means is that whatever the Starchild's brain was made of was rather different to what our brain is made of. The consistency of the, well, not really flesh, is it? The consistency of material, or the grey matter, whatever you want to call it, appears to have been different. And also the inner ears are 50% larger than human ears, and we've got a CAT scan of that later. So this is, as I said earlier on, the eye sockets. With the eye socket on the human, you can go in 2 inches. You can shove your finger right to the back, down to the bottom of the optic foramens, which is where the optic nerve goes through into the brain. 2 inches on the Starchild, on the human, ½ inch on the Starchild. Very different right away. And again, similarly, looking at the rear view, you saw this on the overview at the start. The Starchild's occipital is stretched high and flattened, so this bone is like an arch almost, and this is much lower. And it's also got this raised area here, this area where the inion is. Starchild is not quite flat, but it's much flatter. The human female Indian at the bottom has a wide fossa, that's depressions on both sides. And Starchild has a uniform symmetrical crease, thus no upward pressure from hydrocephaly. And we're going to come back to that. Hydrocephaly is not an explanation for this skull. And there are robust and numerous Wormian bones along the Starchild's left lambdoidal suture, which is against the left parietal. So this, I think, is these sort of wavy lines here. These are the Wormian bones. It's an indication of age at death beyond childhood. So these bones are fused together. This skull didn't die as a child. It died as a fully mature being. The skull was fully fused. And again, what is this? You see in a completely different view. The Starchild on the right is tilted forward more than the human female on the left. The coronal sutures on view. All sutures of both skulls are healthy. There's no premature fusing. Stains on the Starchild due to soil it was buried in, so this staining here, and there's some on the lower jaw as well, that is consistent with the story. Difference in the crowns. Starchild has a crease of highly uniform depth and breadth across the entire rear of the upper crown. That's this thing here. And that, again, it rules out upward pressure from hydrocephaly, which is water on the brain, which is where the skull inflates. I've got some pictures of that later on. And again, you can see the basilar part, this is here, and also the foramen magnum, which is the neck hole, totally different. You know, you can see that this is a different shape, and the sort of shape of the bones around it is a lot different. You can see that this is more ellipsoid, elliptical in characteristics, and this is more of a sort of circular, not quite circular as you can see, but it's more towards that shape. That's normally fused at age 25. Absence in Starchild indicates less than 25 at death, if it's similar development to humans. Could have snapped off at some point. Note the great reduction in the Starchild's lower face connection points, which are called the condyles, mastoids, mandibular fossa, and the zygomatic arches, which I've got a picture of shortly. The surface area on the human female for this area here, if you look at that, it's twice what the Starchild's is. And the human female cheekbone, the zygomatic arch, allows 2 average male fingers to easily fit under, and 2 soda straws would fit under the Starchild's if it were present. And the maxilla, the tooth and roof part of the SC, they will be seen later. So we've got part of the tooth that survived as well, part of the maxilla. So looking again from a slightly different angle at some of those parts, this is where the neck muscles attach, and you can see it's much reduced on the Starchild. It's about half the surface area. And these again, the zygomatic arches, so you can see these are probably about half as well. These are where they would have been on the skull had they survived, but they got broken off. And the other thing is the centre of gravity, of this skull. If you were to look at this, you can see that that's sort of straight up there, and this is, you've got more of this behind this line than you have with the human skull in proportion. There's much more in front here than with this one. So the balance point, the centre of gravity is different. This means that the way that the skull actually sat on the neck was completely different. Both this sort of look at it and the look from other angles shows that the centre of balance, centre of gravity was completely different, and the way the neck muscles attached was also different. Another look at the chewing muscles, and these extend, because they go onto your jawbone. It's up to this sort of area, and you can actually see, you can't really see it on the slides. If you have the real skulls and you're a specialist and you know what to look for, you can see these lines where the muscles attach, and you can see those lines on the surface of the skull. Now, if you look at that on the human, you've got this sort of area, and on the Starchild, you've got this sort of area. So again, you've got about half the surface area of chewing muscles. And the mandibular fossa, the dents in the skull where the mandible, lower jaw fits, indicate a very narrow lower face, also in the range of half normal size. If such an extensive reduction of muscle mass were to have been the result of a natural deformity, how would its genes know to also halve the size of the jaw? So all of these features are showing you that this isn't a deformity. This is perfectly natural for this being. It grew this way. It wasn't a deformity. And this was an X-ray that was done. You can see the date if you look closely on this, if you're closer to the screen. 24th of February 1999. This was done fairly early on in the research because the skulls were basically passed on to Lloyd Pye in 1999. I think it was probably only a couple of weeks before this was done. But of course, again, on the left we've got the human female, and on the right we have the Starchild. I mean, what's going on with this picture? Because in the human female you can see these sort of, what looks like these sort of cloudy, sort of misty areas here. Maybe almost like a cauliflower has been likened to. That's actually your frontal sinuses. And in the Starchild, there are not even vestiges or nubs of sinuses. It has no frontal sinuses. Also, the Starchild eye sockets are round in shape. These are, you can see, are different. These almost look like a pair of spectacles here, if you look at it. And we don't know what that means. Sockets round shape, lower placement, an odd upsweep at the upper outside corners, which I think I've got. You can see this here. You can see this is just, it looks like eyebrows in the X-ray. It's extremely peculiar. And if you study this in detail and depth, a lot of differences. And you can see this sort of outline here, which is totally different to what you see here. It's a totally different shape. And this has got many more darker areas here, as you can see, than this. And that's because the bone on this is thicker, as we shall see. Despite the parallel eye sockets, the images are not balanced. And this is trying to line these eye sockets up across the way here. I think I've got the line here, look. So that's sort of lining up the eye sockets. The Starchild's forehead is tipped higher than normal position during X-ray process. The human female is a classic example of cradle boarding. And we'll come back to that. Flat as the board, if it was strapped from top of the crown to the top of the inion. I've got another slide where we show this. We'll come back to this here. So you can see you've got this quite a straight line there with a little bump there. Veins in the human female run from the temple to the crown of the skull. So you've got some veins going from the temple here to the crown of the skull. Same with the Starchild. You're going basically up at an angle of, say, 10 o'clock. Up to the top there. Same with the Starchild skull, and the fact that you can see these veins here means no water on the brain's outer surface. Again, no hydrocephaly. Brains pressed into the bone, leave enough imprints. Great expansion of brain in the SC's parietal area. The bulge is clear, which I think is this area. So if you look, again, you've got this much bigger sort of shaded area here, light area here, and it's much darker around this area. So this shows you the capacity of the brain is much bigger. Okay, and now you're going to hear Lloyd Pye tell us about these in a moment, but these were the CAT scans that were done. I think, again, they were done in 1999, and you can see, I think, on the... Yeah, so this is the inner ear, this red circle here. It's about twice the size of the human female. And this shows CAT scan image showing open, healthy suture lines here, because you've got these little gaps here, so that's healthy. So this thing wasn't deformed, it wasn't hydrocephalic, it wasn't some other bone deformity, it was healthy when it died. And then the brain cast, these were done relatively recently in the time of the research that was done. What they did was they took a replica of the original skull, and then they took another replica of that, filled it up with material, and then they split open that replica and revealed what was inside to get these brain casts. And here, hopefully, if we're in luck.
Hi, this is Lloyd Pye. I'm sitting here in London at the home of Belinda McKenzie, and I'm with my friend Andrew Johnson, who's filming me, and we're going to talk about the brain casts of the Starchild skull and a typical human brain. Nobody's done this up to this point, so we figured it was time to put it out there and let people see the differences. As you can see, a human brain, and this comes from the lining of the inside of the skull, so that's really all you're seeing is the surface of the brain. But as you see, it's very lumpy. Everybody knows that a human brain, and really all animal brains, have convolutions like this that fold into the surface and leave these lumps and bumps, and it's just the way it is. But you also see very fine veins. When any creature's born, its bones, or the bones of a skull, are so soft that the brain itself presses in and the bone will take the shape of whatever's there. So you can get the fine degree of veins, all these bumps and lumps, and just a typical brain. So let's start out with that, just the surface, and you see the difference of the Starchild, completely smooth. I mean, just absolutely smooth, except for the suture lines, which are very visible, and the veins. Again, the veins you can see trailing off here, but no convolutions. So radical difference in that one area. Now, another area of a radical difference is the frontal lobes. Now, as you look and see, the human has frontal lobes, and that gives us our brow ridges. This fills in our brow ridges, and we all have that. And we all have this, and this is a lot of personality. This is a lot of who we are, what we are. Not so much thinking is where we make our good decisions and our bad decisions, our irrational moves, and make us crazy, and also allow us to do sometimes very good things. You notice the Starchild just does not have that. It just doesn't have frontal lobes at all. And it has no brow ridges, and that's one of the real distinctive differences about it. But you also see the extreme shallowness of the Starchild's eye socket compared to the human eye socket. Human goes that far down, Starchild goes that far down. Just a very, very radical, complete difference. It's just got a completely different kind of eyeball set. And one of the real interesting things about this fact was I was in Philadelphia early part of this year, and I was talking to a brain person and showing them this not long after they had been made, and they're just plastic injection molds. And she looked at this and she says, well, with eye sockets this shallow, the eye can't be an eye like we have. It can't be a ball that moves and looks through a kind of a tube, and we have peripheral vision. Everybody knows how our eyes move in these big, deep eye sockets. So as she was looking at it, she said, it has to be a kind of a flat eye. And I've been saying that for years whenever I lecture about it. So it has to be kind of a flat eye. And if it's a flat eye, in order to get 180 degrees of vision, and that's the purpose of vision when your eyes are in front of your head, you want to see at least 180 degrees around you. With us, we can move our eyes. We see through a tube, and then we have peripheral vision. With this, she said, if it's a flat eye stuck in the head and not moving, it has to be basically all pupil, all basically black, all pupil, just sitting there taking in the whole field of vision at one time. But if it does that, that means it has to have a much bigger visual cortex in order to handle that much input all at once, all the time. So she flips it over. Let's look at the visual cortex. And she says, oh, wow, look at that. Look how expanded it is over compared to the human visual cortex. And the human visual cortex is this two knobby areas right here. And the Starchild is as much as twice, really, spread out over. Smaller knobs, but stretched, the area itself is stretched out over here. So, this is what she said, and this is what we take her word on, that this is good, strong evidence that the Starchild had a very, very different visual system than we do. And I've been saying it for a long time, just based on the difference in the eye sockets and the way the optic foramens are set in, where the blood vessels and nerves come in and control the eyeball and feed the eyeball and all that. Completely different in the Starchild. So, all things considered, these are some interesting aspects to add to the great mystery between the Starchild and humans, and of course, what is the Starchild?
So that clip was filmed at Belinda Mackenzie's house literally 2 months before he died. And the intention was to actually, basically try and get a better film of that, because it was just see if I can get rid of that silly message. It was basically to try and want to do a better video. It's gone by itself, thankfully, because you could see that it's just all white. It's just white plastic, and it needs some type of staining or something. But unfortunately, that film was never made to get a better, breakdown of what that actually shows you. And that, I'm just so glad that I took that film. I literally had a pocket camera, high definition camera, pulled it out, and we did it in one take. Didn't even know he had those when I went down to see him. Okay, so now we'll look at the teeth. And we actually had, amazingly enough, we had this piece of tooth which survived, and you can see here that we've actually had two teeth which were used for DNA testing, actually, and we've got this maxilla piece which was recovered with the Starchild skull. This is called the maxilla, the whole thing. In the left image, the smooth curve from the top middle to the left centre is the nasal passage. That's the nasal passage there. Thus, the Starchild had a nose opening, if not a nose, similar to humans. Unlike the missing frontal sinuses, maxillary sinuses are present, so it did have some sinuses around its nose. Above two teeth that are visible, and also visible at the tops of the three extraction holes. So these where the teeth are extracted here. Other teeth are impacted into the bone, suggesting child's teeth. An arrangement of teeth also suggests first dentition, so it's like these are milk teeth. But the larger tooth is now gone, sacrificed to the DNA test. This one is, in other words, being taken for DNA test. The small one remains in situ and is seen in extreme close-up in the next slide. So this is the close-up, and what this reveals is that there's heavy wear around the edge of the tooth. And note that the clear pitting and shearing of the enamel along the top surface. So you can see there's the bit there. You probably have to see this closer, close up and look at it on a computer screen. But there is pitting. You see that's wear. Cracks in the enamel is crazing, which can result from years of hard use, sometimes or result from or sometimes result from post-mortem contraction. So when the body, is dead, the teeth can actually sort of contract and crack. At present, the teeth are not able to provide an accurate age of death. So we've got contradictory evidence, I think. You'll see on the next slide, maybe on the next slide after this. It appeared to have milk teeth still, to come down, but it appeared also to have adult teeth as well. So this is why it's got contradictory evidence. Now what they did was they took that piece of maxilla and they made a mirror image of it. And so this essentially is what the upper roof of the mouth would have looked like. Mirror image maxilla has a uniquely flat roof, which means it had a very small tongue or no tongue at all. So that's another indication about speech. Because just to dwell on that, if it didn't have a tongue, maybe it didn't speak. If it didn't have sinuses, anyone know what? I don't know. I forgot to say this earlier on. Anyone know what sinuses are used for?
To drain away. I know that they get blocked in their tubes, but I'm not. I thought it was to drain away fluids and things.
Nope.
It's an echo chamber.
It's an echo chamber for your voice. It's to give your voice resonance. So if this thing had no frontal sinuses, maybe it didn't need an echo chamber for its voice because it didn't have one. At least not in the way that we have. So these are this is an inverted X-ray, and I actually met the chap who made these X-rays. That was done in London in 2004. So this is the piece of maxilla. That's the tooth that's sticking out. That's the one that remained at the time. And you can see it's got these unerupted teeth, and this is what the dentist said. X-rays of maxilla fragment show unerupted, as in they haven't come down, they haven't come out. Molars still in the bone. Several dentists have stated that they believe the Starchild skull to be a child in this age range. Dr. Davies tweets, he also suggested that. However, other specialists, unwilling to be named, felt that extensive wear on the crowns of the teeth and the extensive size of the roots indicate the skull belonged to an adult, so as I already said. So it's contradictory evidence. Okay, so the bone has also been studied close up with what's called an SEM, that's a scanning electron microscope, and a binocular microscope, and also chemical analysis has been done on the bone. So we'll look at that now. So, scanning electron microscope reveals fibres emerging from the skull's cancellous holes. So these holes here are called cancellous holes, and we're going to get some close-ups of these. Hopefully, even at the back, you can see these little sort of fibrous things. Such microscopic entities are never present in normal human bone, these fibres, not profuse nor consistent in appearance, but evident in multiple views. Note the cutting blade did not sever them, indicating extreme durability. Slides were shown to mycologists to learn if the fibres were fungi or bacteria. Mycologists said they were unlike anything they knew, but with 30,000 possibilities of what they could be. They suggested a mouldy tuft test to definitely rule out fungal or bacterial contamination. Very unlikely to be that. This view of these fibres and others to follow provide the first glimpses of a phenomenon that could prove to be entirely new, and it is still, since this was made, nothing has been discovered like it since these slides were made back in 13 years ago. So we can see that, you know, a couple of these fibres they focused in on. This has gone together in like a knot. Characteristic of capillaries, in other words, too small for veins, but closer analysis does not bear this inspection out. Don't know what the fibres are. We don't know whether it's inorganic material or organic material. We have no idea how it could have been tied into a knot under the pressure of bone cutting, much less how it survived the process, because this was a Dremel blade. Anyone familiar with a Dremel tool? High-speed rotating disc that cuts through material. That's what it was used to cut it. How did it survive? Threads found near the knot, yet completely different in size, shape and apparent texture. More like threads or hairs than capillaries tied into a knot. Here too we have no idea what to say until tests reveal the biochemical makeup, and to my knowledge that still hasn't been done because there's no money to do the tests. This is a project which has been done with volunteers and amateurs and such like. They decided to call this picture the claw just simply because of this appearance, and what you see in here is that this was where the Dremel blade was stopped, so you've got this abrupt line of cut-off where the blade was stopped, and this I think was being broken off somehow after a cut. Notice the fibre-like things hanging on it upward and downward. You can't see this very well on this screen. This projector should be brighter than it is, but I'm not sure why that is. This is a bit closer of this. So you've got this button. What's that? It doesn't look like a piece of bone. It's not a piece of Dremel blade. We don't know what this is. We think the button is a remnant of another kind of fibre, or the snap-back base of one like the one on view. No one can tell. Notice a piece extending in the opposite button on the other side of the fibre, which I think is, again, probably easier to see with a better picture than this. So this is also a key picture, comparison of bone thickness. The skulls were basically had pieces cut out of them for the bone analysis and for DNA analysis, and you can see the examples here where these cuts were made. And as you can see, the Starchild bone, 3 millimetres thick, human bone, 9 millimetres, 1/3 as thick. How can this be? This is completely outside anything that you can get with human bone. And again, that's borne out by the study of the bone chemistry. With the human on the left, you've got these quantities of carbon and oxygen. This was done, I think, with this elevated aluminium spike came in the first SEM analysis of the Starchild bone. Aluminium is poisonous to humans in these quantities, so we assume it arrived by contamination. However, we can't think of a viable way for a skull buried in a mine tunnel to be contaminated by aluminium without water as a dissolving medium. Spikes in carbon and oxygen and reduced phosphorus and calcium establish a much higher level of collagen. Starchild's bone is much more like tooth enamel than ordinary human bone. It's very, very hard. And when they actually drilled this with a Dremel blade, initially they sort of put the tool down onto the skull and it bounced off. With a human skull, just pretty much goes straight in there because it's going so fast. Human bone's just quite soft compared to the Starchild. This thing actually, the Dremel blade bounced off. Now to really force it down. The smell was different when they cut it. Lloyd told me this story. When they cut it with the Dremel blade, the smell was really powerful, very acrid compared to what you'd normally get with cutting the human. So, we can also see here a comparison of the inner surfaces of the skulls, the human on the left and the Starchild on the right. So they'll put a little endoscope or something up inside the neck hole and then taken these pictures with a little camera, and you can see the character of the bone, the surface of the bone again is very much different. This looks pretty smooth. Human remained on the surface of the mine tunnel while the SC was buried for over 900 years. Even buried, at least some of the degree of encrustation might be expected. There's no encrustation on this, whereas there is on this. So that maybe this again is indicative of there's some type of chemical reaction which goes on with the human bone in that environment, but not the same chemical reaction doesn't happen with the Starchild. Similarly, again, this is the outer surface, again, close up with the binocular microscope, I think this time. That's a reference point of 1 millimetre in length, or a reference measure, 1 millimetre here, of course. And again, you know, you've got many more of these little, I think they're called wormine holes here, I think. And again, very different appearance under the same illumination and everything. And then if you look at these in colour, you look at these so-called cancellous holes, what they discovered here, this is 0.5 millimetre as a reference measurement. You've got this peculiar red residue, which kind of looks like dried blood. But remember, this is 900 years old. Or any organic material like blood or blood cells or tissue, from capillaries, that would have all been eaten away by bacteria over that time. No idea what the red residue is. Compelled to find out. Still hasn't been discovered. Organic desiccated marrow, is it that? Inorganic mineral residue? If mineral, what could it possibly be? If marrow, then DNA tests already carried out should have recovered nuclear DNA, which they didn't originally, but we'll come to that in a bit. Backlit cross-section of the Starchild skull here. Another polished piece of SC bone here, flipped upside down when being labelled. Nonetheless, a reddish residue is evident here too. You can see this here and here, and in other places here as well. Clinging to the upper and lower surface of the cancellous holes. Again, bacteria should have scoured this clean. After 900 years, nothing should be here, nothing at all. Yet it's there. Okay, so we are now at the 45-minute mark, and I think I'll probably just play this clip and do next couple of slides, because when you've got this much evidence, and we're only about, for the evidence, we're probably just over halfway through, perhaps, arguably less. This has got to be debunked, because what we're looking at is provably, I would say, not human. It looks human in sort of morphology, vaguely, but it's not human. So you've got to debunk it. So, what do the skeptics say who have looked at this? And skeptics have looked at this, as we'll come to. The skeptics will generally just focus on a few aspects. They won't talk about the red residue. They won't talk about the fibres. They won't talk about for example, the inner ear. They won't talk about the X-rays that I've shown you. They'll primarily focus on the shape of the skull, the overall shape. So they'll claim that it's cradle-boarded, and that gives it this flat appearance at the back. They'll claim that it's a victim of hydrocephaly. They'll claim that it's a victim of progeria, and there are a couple of others which we could probably mention as well. They will claim anything to explain away other anomalies such as bone hardness as a result of various other medical conditions, some of which would preclude the survival of the being to the age it must have been to have the physical features it had. So now we're going to cover the three main claims now. So they'll claim, for example, that it's hydrocephaly, but that results in weak bone, and you can show that it's got strong bone. Or they'll claim that it's progeria, but that also, which can sort of explain the shape of the skull, as we'll see in a minute, but progeria results in brittle bone, which isn't what the skull has. So it can't be progeria. So the cradle boarding, that's the first thing. So they're saying that here, like with the human skull, they're saying that this is cradle boarded. So they're not looking at the Starchild now, this is the human one. And the human female was indeed cradle boarded. You've got this straight line here. You can see how that straight is when I put, how straight that is rather, when I put that line on from PowerPoint. And what would happen if you don't know what cradle boarding is, just to explain the picture on the left, in the area where this was discovered, Copper Canyon, 900 years ago, people were living off the land. They weren't doing like us and going to Asda to get a shopping, cart full of groceries every week or so. They were working on the land. They had to eke out a living from the land. Planting things, growing things, harvesting fruit, whatever, harvesting crops, hard work. So you didn't really have time to stop and have a baby. You maybe had a few days off with your baby, looking after it, and feeding it for maybe a couple of weeks or something. But then you were back on the land. So what would you do with your baby when there was no one to look after it and all the men were, hunting or whatever? Well, you put the baby on a board, strapped its head so that its head wouldn't roll over, and it couldn't hold its head up, and the baby's head was on the board, and it resulted in this. So this human female, who I don't know how old she was when she died, she was cradle boarded. Not so with the Starchild. You can clearly see now, if you see the comparison, you've got a straight line there, but this is more of a curve. This is more of a curve. And you can see this bone sticks out, and you've got these features here. This was never cradle boarded. So it's observably false. So any skeptic who says that this is a cradle boarded skull is a liar. They're not a skeptic, they are a liar. Simple as that. And similarly, if you get this situation with the cradle boarding with a human skull, then when the baby has its neck on the board, it can breathe. But with the angle where the neck attached and the morphology of the skull, the Starchild skull would have been like that if it was cradle boarded. Would have choked to death. Can't have been cradle boarded. Anybody who says it's cradle boarded is a liar. Plain and simple. Is it hydrocephalic? Well, here we see an unfortunate picture of a young child with hydrocephaly. And this is basically where you have this problem with spinal fluid. There's a regular circulation of spinal fluid which goes up into your cranial cavity, your skull, basically. And I don't know what it does up there, but then it comes down again through another hole in the skull, goes back down into your spine, and that's what happens with a normal human, with a normally formed skull and everything, and spine. But with hydrocephaly, the spinal fluid accumulates and can't get back out. And what they do nowadays is they put a shunt in. So they put a shunt in the side of the neck. And I used to have a student who had hydrocephaly, and you could see the shunt sort of in his neck here. It was like, almost looked like he got a pen top stuck in his neck. But that was the shunt for his spinal fluid to come down. It was fine. He was perfectly good student, perfectly healthy and everything. But what happens is, because the skull inflates, as you can see on the right here, the separate bones that make the skull up never get a chance to fuse together. So when the child dies, the skull will basically fall apart because it's not fused. This is just soft tissue here, this white area is held together with soft tissue. So that's healthy, that's hydrocephaly. And the hydrocephalic skull is totally different to the normal skull. And again, I said earlier on, we've got this crease here. That's not hydrocephaly. The skull has not been inflated. If it was inflated, this would be bulged out. It's not. It goes inwards. It's not hydrocephaly. And you can see here, this is a hydrocephalic skull. It's completely different. This bulges out in a different way. This is much more ovoid shape. This is more circular. It's not hydrocephalic. Now, we can see the crease in the suture line seen on the outside. They're clearly not fused. In any case, just from the overall shape, you can see it's not hydrocephalic. So this proves that this wasn't hydrocephalic. Again, going back, as I said earlier on, you can see these lines of the veins. The vein tracks are clear inside both skulls, proving no fluid was on the Starchild's brain. Because there is fluid there, the veins don't press into the surface of the skull, so you don't get these lines on the X-ray, you don't get these sort of impressions made in the bone in this way. Is it progeria? This is a condition which causes premature aging. And you can see, you have the symptoms of old age by the time you're 3 years old. and you get these features in the body: a baldness, swollen veins, absence of eyebrows and eyelashes, a beak-shaped nose, shrunken chin, premature cardiac disease, narrow chest, swollen and stiff joints, and age spots on the skin. In typical progeria victims, bones thin out, becoming weak and brittle. So this was a mock-up. I'll come back to this mock-up a bit later, but this was a mock-up that was made, and you can see this sort of mimics the shape, and it's different. It's just totally different. Although there are certain similarities, like the lower face is smaller, and the ears are still higher, and the skull is more domed as well with a progeria victim. And if you then, and as I said, if you then superimpose and do the scaling and put the Starchild skull and superimpose it over the progeria victim, the shape does not fit. The profile does not fit. It's not a progeria victim. And the sort of, the final sort of nail in the coffin for that is that progeria victims usually have an unclosed fontanelle. So you get essentially this gap here where the bones haven't fused, and here. These are not present on the Starchild skull. Provably not progeria. It isn't progeria. And with a CT scan projection of the progeria victim's skull and a normal human skull, you can see this is, again, you see the domed appearance and the thing with the teeth going on. Again, totally different. So this actually resembles the Starchild skull more than the progeria victim, even though that's the human one. Or the normal human, I should say. And that's the progeria victim. You can see, you've got all this sort of lumpiness, this sort of lumpy texture, not seen on the Starchild skull. And we already saw the bone thickness. Yes, it's thin bone on the Starchild skull, which sort of matches the progeria victim, but unfortunately for the skeptics, it's 2 to 3 times as hard as human bone, even though it is a third of the thickness. It doesn't match progeria. It's not progeria, it's not hydrocephaly. And it isn't deformed. It's perfectly formed. Okay, so what I'm going to do there is, so that we've dealt with some of the skeptics' arguments, but we're going to have a break now for maybe sort of 15 minutes or so, and then we're going to talk about what I've got on the slide there, which is a kind of one of the most skeptical sort of things that you'll come across if you go and Google Starchild skull on the internet. So thank you very much for listening to the first half. As you can see on the slide here, I sometimes don't use that name. I insert another letter in this, but I won't say what that letter is because it's awful, this thing coming up. You do a Google search, this thing comes up first for almost everything, yet it's not peer-reviewed, it's not properly peer-reviewed, we don't know who owns it, etc. So Wikipedia, they posted an article about Starchild skull, and it's based on an article by Stephen Novella, who's, I forget whether he's a geneticist or somebody who talks about anatomy or biology, but Lloyd tells the story of this. This recording is from 2009.
Yeah. Okay. So here's what happened with Wikipedia. When people said, "Do you know what they say about you on Wikipedia?" I said, "Well, no, not really. I hadn't even looked at it. I didn't even know I was on Wikipedia. It was really a surprise. This was several years ago." And I read it and I said, "God, where did they come up with this garbage?" And so I said, I'm gonna fix this. And so I started trying to fix it. Every time I would try to fix it, a day or two later, it would be fixed back the way it was. What was that about? So I started calling to see, who can I talk to? I got to get this fixed. This is wrong. Ultimately, I worked my way up to the head honcho of the states with Wikipedia. He was a guy in Florida, and it turns out that most of Wikipedia is written and maintained by graduate students in colleges around the world. Graduate students who have nothing better to do, who don't have enough work to do, that's what they do. And when they put and they watch out for alternative knowledge people. Anything to do with alternative knowledge, they're going to slag it. They're going to trash it. They're going to put it up and slag it as hard as they can. And then they put monitors on it so that if anybody tries to change anything, they have tip-offs in their computers and they fix it back the way it was. Okay? So I got the head honcho and I said, look, everything some of it's right, but most of it's wrong. Just not just wrong, but bad wrong, egregiously wrong. And I'd like you to get it fixed and get it closer to right. And he said, Mr. Pye, you are the last person on earth that I would expect to tell the truth about yourself. I'm the last person on earth to really know the truth about myself. When I was born, all this sort of stuff. Yeah, it's ridiculous, but that is their attitude. You can't. A guy tried to do that and didn't do it, didn't get anything. But I'll tell you this, I told this last Saturday at London, and a guy said, I didn't believe that. And so I went in and started just making changes to see what would happen. He said, one change lasted 12 hours. One change lasted 18 hours. Another one lasted all the way up to 48 hours. But he says, I see what you mean. They will not let your material be changed. And it won't. It's not even worth trying. Now, another thing I can tell you about the criticism of the Starchild that you'll read about on the internet is this. There's plenty of it, but it's all built around one article by one man, written in late 1999. Remember when I told you that the DNA came in from the Canada lab and it was negative and that was it? Okay. A guy, like a professional skeptic, a guy who really works hard for the skeptics, wrote an article about it, and that article became like gospel to all the critics and all the skeptics. Stephen Novella is his name. Stephen Novella, if you want to look it up. Okay, Stephen Novella. Yeah, I'm going to lose my voice here pretty soon screaming like this. Novella wrote this article, put it out there in 1999, and it became the reference, and to this day, I don't know that another skeptic, serious skeptic, or Skeptic Magazine has ever tackled the Starchild. I know that Skeptic Magazine has not. I know that the Skeptical Inquirer has not, and those are the big two. Why not? Because they know we're doing good work here. They let the Novella article stand and they reference it every time because he wrote it in 1999 when I had made a lot of mistakes and I didn't know very much. And when the DNA came in negative, so that's what they use as if that's a fact. So I let it go, and in 2003, when the DNA evidence came in, there was another big push for it, and the critics got stirred up, and then it went away. Then in 2006, when the DNA test was announced, the 454 test was announced, and I started announcing on my website, okay, we're going to win this. This is it. This is what we've been waiting for 3 years for. This is it. Home run city coming our way. Then they really cranked up. And so it got so bad that I contacted Novella. I wrote him an email and I said, look, I understand how this game is played. You're in this to win. You're in this for my blood. You're in this to make me look as bad as you can. I understand. But let's play a little bit fair. Could we? Here's what your article says that's completely wrong, and here's what the truth of it is. Could you at least put some balance? Could you say, this is what I think, this is what he says? Just do anything to fix it up so that it's a little more balanced and a little more fair. Could you do anything? And he sent me back this one-line reply. The article stands as written. The article stands as written. But he did make one change, one critical, crucial change. Instead of looking at a copyright date of 1999 on that article, you will find a copyright date of 2006. He bumped it up to then, as if in 2006 that was the truth. This is how they play. It's hardball, folks. It is hardball. They take no prisoners. They have to win. See, the difference is I can live with losing this. I can go back to my life as a hominoid and human origins researcher. My life doesn't depend on this. Their life depends on maintaining the status quo because everything changes for them. They are hanging off a cliff by their fingernails. I'm just poor. It's a different feeling. You know what I'm saying? So they really play hard. Yes?
Lloyd, do you think there's a structured intelligence?
And you got a flavour of how Lloyd sort of dealt with these issues. So what you get with skeptic is they just, like I said, one thing they do is lie, which I've already talked about. The other thing is they'll just ignore evidence as it suits them. I wanted to show this as an example of how the mainstream handles certain difficult topics. Now in this clip you're going to see Melanie Young, the owner of the Starchild skull, and you're going to see this chap David Aguilar, who's actually surprised with the skull.
How did you come into possession of the skull?
Well, a friend who got it from a friend who was the original owner of it gave it to me due to my expertise in neonatal nursing and anatomy. When I saw it and told them that this is totally out of this world, they were like, take it, don't bring it back. If it were a hydrocephalic, this would be bulged out, okay? But only one side would be bulged out, or the back would be bulged. It wouldn't be symmetrical like that is.
So a hydrocephalic skull is asymmetrical.
It's asymmetrical.
And this skull is symmetrical.
It's completely symmetrical. If that were a hydrocephalic, the bones would not be connected. There would be no skull.
What other explanation do you have for this skull?
I don't have one. I can't find one.
People have been seeing aliens for thousands of years, but there's never been a single piece of hard evidence. Now, it's possible the Starchild skull is just that.
We are here today with Lloyd Pye, who has worked as a military intelligence specialist. He has more than 30 years studying cryptozoology. He's the primary expert on the Starchild skull, having researched it for more than a decade.
Why all this interest in it?
I believe that it stands a very good chance of being the smoking gun that everybody is looking for, the holy grail of the field of UFO alien research.
Could you walk us through the main differences between the Starchild skull and a normal human skull?
The eye sockets of a normal human are about 2 inches. Starchild's not even 1. There are no sinuses in here, no upper sinuses at all. And you turn them around, you notice that the chewing muscles that come up through here and spread out to attach your jaw and chew cover quite a wide area here. With the Starchild, it's much reduced, so we have a much smaller, much reduced lower face. And there are fibers woven through the matrix of the bone, which were found under a scanning electron microscope.
Does this skull have any fibers at all?
No skull of any kind of primate that we know of, or any really bone that we know of, has those kind of fibers. They seem to be unique to the Starchild. If you turn around and look on the inside and you feel in here, you feel that ridging of bone that will hold the cerebellum in place. With the Starchild, because it has such expanded brain pressing down that way, at such a steep angle, we should have a spreading of the foramen magnum, but we don't. So we have a very different kind of brain in this skull, whatever it is. Now, if you stick your finger in the foramen magnum hole to simulate a neck, right, you see how the human is there, so it would be like this, but the Starchild's actually balanced like this. So it's kind of like a misshapen golf ball on a tee. It's very different from the human neck in that it's half the size and it's centered up under the head.
When you see how the neck connects to the skull, that's a closure for me. It's not a deformity. It was built that way.
We've had the DNA of the human tested fully recovered, no problem, normal human being. But in 2003, we found that the DNA of the Starchild was very different. While we could recover its mitochondrial DNA, which comes from its mother, the nuclear DNA, which contains the DNA of its mother and its father, we could not recover that, which indicates that there's something very unusual, if not completely different, about the father.
To your knowledge, is there any reason why the nuclear DNA was not recoverable other than the fact that it's not a human father?
If the father had been human, all indications are it should have pulled up very easily with the primers that were used, but it didn't, so we can only conclude that there's something very unusual about the father.
I'm really excited to meet with David Aguilar because David Aguilar has written a number of books for National Geographic on what's going on out there in the solar system and what other life forms may look like.
We are talking to NASA, we're talking to the Origins of Life initiative here at Harvard. We're actively searching for life in the universe.
This really elevates our investigation to have a Harvard scientist weigh in and talk to us about the real possibilities of alien life coming into contact with Earth.
What shapes, what forms, what evolutionary pattern they might take. Boy, that's the big mystery today. But of course, things are going to evolve differently on another planet. And there's no reason that we would have humanoids. I mean, the chance of finding humanoids that look like us, like you see in Star Trek, are so unbelievably small. You're going to get intelligent creatures, but they may not look anything like we would even relate to an intelligence. There's no telling what could be possible, but since we don't have anything in our hands to look at and compare, I mean, I'd love to bring one of these guys into a real lab and have everybody take a look at it.
David, you just said that there's no evidence of extraterrestrial life right now. We think we may have something here.
Wait a minute. Guys, what am I looking at?
This skull was found in a cave in northern Mexico. It was carbon dated to 900 years ago. Look at the eye sockets. Look at the shape of the head, and look at the neck.
I'm curious, any DNA samples from this?
The mitochondrial DNA is human. They did the nuclear DNA test and could not sequence the father's DNA from the nucleus of the cell.
Are you saying this was a cross with an alien or just a human with a terrible deformity?
That's one theory. It's a hybrid.
Prove it.
So, there's the rub. This is a guy at a university, and Lloyd encountered this probably 100 times. If you go back and listen carefully to what he says, this David Aguilar says, while standing in front of the whiteboard or the screen, I'd love to bring one of these guys into a real lab and have everybody take a look at it. At that point, they don't know he's got the skull. So they pull it out, they put it in his hands, and then they show him the Starchild skull, and Burns suggests it could be a human hybrid, and he says, prove it. He doesn't say, wow, this looks like a real alien skull. Can I take it into my lab and test it, please? In other words, he says, yikes, I actually don't want to take this into the lab and have everybody look at it because I would be finished with all my speculative fun. That's what he's actually saying. He knows that if he honestly tested that, it would prove that something like aliens exists, or a completely different species to humans. So, you heard in that clip them talking about DNA, but the DNA tests were done in 2003 with limited technology, you might say. So what is DNA? DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. So we're just going to go through a few brief notes about that. The human body is trillions of cells. You've got 46 human chromosomes, 23 male, 23 female, and approximately 30,000 genes codes for proteins that perform most of life's functions. There are 3 billion subunits called base pairs made up of these three chemicals, which are on the next slide. Cytosine is one, guanine is another, thymine is the other one, and adenine. And you get this double helix that you've probably seen in various science documentaries and so forth. And this is what is used to reproduce living beings. It's the DNA. The DNA is the code of life. It's like a digital code, but with a 4-bit code rather than a 2-bit code like as we have in computers. So each being has 2 types of DNA. We have the mitochondrial DNA, or each human has 2 types of DNA. We have mitochondrial DNA, and that's found in the cell mitochondria, and it contains genetic material only from the mother, from the maternal side. So the mitochondrial is maternal DNA. The nuclear DNA and new DNA is found in the cell nucleus, and it contains genetic material from both parents, so it's a mix of mum and dad. And except for red blood cells, each human cell has nuclear DNA and nuclear DNA and mitochondrial DNA in all cells in the body. So this is an example of what you used to get with an early type of DNA test, with using primers. Early DNA testing used primers with 20 to 30 base pairs, so they're short fragments of DNA, 20 to 30 base pairs long, which you then use to attach to DNA, and then you reproduce those strands. Here is an early array in a gel sheet. The primers mark the beginning and ends of the part of the DNA that will be copied. A technique called electrophoresis is used to sort the nucleic acid sequences to give you this sort of, and it's not a rainbow because it's not a colour, but it almost looks like a spectrum without colour, if you see what I mean, which is essentially what it is. Now, the first DNA test that was done on the Starchild, where they cut off a piece of the tooth, they put it through these PCR cycles in a DNA sequencing test, which PCR is on the next slide. I can never remember what this stands for. But they did this first test at a Bold lab, in the Bold lab, which was a forensic pathology lab, I think, in the University of British Columbia in 1999. And the students performed the majority of the work done on it. The lab was not equipped in many special ways necessary for handling samples more than 50 years old. The Starchild skull is 900 years old, so they really weren't equipped to do this DNA test. They weren't properly equipped. After the lab's student technicians contaminated its first two attempts, they claimed to recover nuclear DNA from a Y chromosome, not the X, and however, this was only 200 picograms of material. That's 1/5 of the minimum amount of genetic material normally required for a valid result. So they declared that they'd got this after a customary run of 28 cycles of PCR. There was a very weak 200 picograms gender profile from the second bone sample taken from the child's mastoid process. The result is XY chromosomes, which tells us two significant things. First, the child was male. The second, the DNA is human. So they declared on this very dodgy, weak sample that they got that it was a human child, human male child. So for Lloyd Pye's work, the Bold lab report was 3 years of dead time because they said it was a human, forget about it, put it in the blender, as I think he said. But when he sort of started publishing this, this is when he was contacted by this lady, Belinda Mackenzie, and she then actually decided, according to what I've been told, to pay for an additional set of DNA tests, which were to be done eventually to be done in 2003. So in 2003, the Starchild project commissioned a DNA analysis of the Starchild skull's bone by Trace Genetics of Davis, California. That was then acquired by DNA Print Genomics in 2005. Again, people will say on the internet, Trace Genetics never existed because it was bought by DNA Print Genomics. That is a lie. It's another skeptic's lie. Its owners and principal geneticists were Dr. Ripen Marley and Dr. Jason Eshelman. They were specialists in recovery of ancient DNA, meaning that DNA samples from more than 50 years old. They both worked on the 5,000 to 9,000 year old Kennewick man skeleton found in Washington State in 1996, Washington State. So these guys were experienced in working with ancient human DNA. They repeated the carbon dating and got the same result as before, 900 years old, plus or minus 40 years. Later analysis of the staining on both skulls and the inorganic chemistry of their bone supported the C14 result that both were exposed to similar conditions after death. That made the human an ideal controls compare contamination and degradation of its DNA against the Starchild's. So in other words, they wanted to compare if the skulls had been found together. And from the evidence that they studied, yes, that part of the story was true. They had been found in the same place. So this was one of the gel sheets that was produced. This was from the human female's mitochondrial DNA because they recovered that. And the Starchild's mitochondrial DNA was also recovered with 20 to 30 base pairs that were recovered. The result indicated that the female and the Starchild could not be maternally related, so they knew that the human female wasn't the Starchild's mother because their mitochondrial DNA did not belong to the same haplogroup. Everyone inherits only their mother's mitochondrial DNA, their grandmother's, their great-grandmother's, etc. 6 failed attempts proved beyond any doubt that the Bold lab test result was wrong. In 6 full attempts, Dr. Eshelman and Dr. Marley could not detect the Starchild's nuclear DNA by polymerase chain reaction, that's PCR. Given that NU DNA was easily recovered from the control skull with the same level of DNA degradation, the Starchild's mitochondrial DNA was easily detectable by PCR. The failure strongly indicated its nuclear DNA was present too, but it was too different from human DNA to be recovered by primers. In other words, these primers, like you put in jigsaw pieces, and these jigsaw pieces attach onto matching jigsaw pieces, and you pull these pieces out. So, as Lloyd said, the 2003 results, the best they could come up with was the mitochondrial DNA looked similar to human beings, so they assumed it was mitochondrial DNA was human in the Starchild skull, so they assumed that it had a human mother and that the father was non-human. That was the assumption then, although it was very limited in terms of what they actually recovered was a very small sample of DNA. This was later shown that this was extremely unlikely. So in July 2006, new DNA recovery techniques were being developed and had been developed where they could be used, and they didn't use these primers. They didn't use these jigsaw pieces to plug into other jigsaw pieces to pull out the piece and look at what that piece was. Now, what they basically used was this 454 life sciences technique. They were from Connecticut. And they announced they had developed a new DNA analysis methodology that enabled sequencing of any unknown DNA sample without prior knowledge of any of its sequences. So you didn't need primers. The 454 technique was also based on using primers, but these primers were standardized for every imaginable analysis, not specific to the DNA to be analyzed. So in other words, they weren't the same sort of primers as previously. But these tests were very expensive, millions of dollars each, so it could not be afforded by anything except those such as profiling the Neanderthal genome, which was funded by universities collectively, which was easy for them to raise $1 million out of their budgets collectively. But then what happened was, in 2010, the Starchild project website had been established for probably 8 or 9 years by that point, and a geneticist contacted Lloyd from an established and well-accredited research facility, and he offered to analyse the Starchild's nuclear DNA. And I know the first name of this gentleman. He's remained anonymous. He's not originally from the US, but he works in the US now. The company is US. And he was able to use this new technique, which was called shotgunning. And it was very labour-intensive, but the geneticist's goal was to find a few fragments of Starchild's missing nuclear DNA at first to see if it was indeed viable, as they suspected in 2003. So in February 2010, the geneticist was provided with a bone sample from the Starchild skull. I think it was actually another of the teeth, or part of one of the teeth or something. And then in March 2010, he finally recovered fragments of DNA from the sample, and then much of that was resulted from an inevitable bacterial contamination. Nonetheless, others were clearly fragments of the Starchild skull's nuclear DNA after 11 years of success, of effort for success. So, what do you do with these results? What do you do with this code? Because what happens is you basically get these strands of DNA, you get this code, you get this digital code, the sequence of letters, which is A, T, T, C, etc. And you get this sort of reading. What you do is you put it into a database. You've got this BLAST report where you can put in the sequence of DNA base pairs with this code of sequence of letters, cytosine, adenine, thymine, and guanine. You can put that sequence in and you get a result back. And it was found that actually a segment of 265 base pairs proves that some Starchild nuclear DNA matched the human DNA. They did get a match to some human DNA. And this work took place over months and years, over a period of at least 2 years, I think. A DNA segment that was recovered, 342 base pairs long. That proves that some Starchild nuclear DNA is not only not human, it is not found in the massive National Institutes for Health database. It states that within the millions of DNA base pair strings catalogued in the NIH database, none were even similar to this section of the Starchild skull's DNA. And this was a result was obtained with a search parameter set to the broadest match criteria that seeks even a somewhat similar match, not only an exact match. What that means is, even though we as humans share some of our DNA with millipedes, for example, with caterpillars, with crocodiles, this particular sequence from the Starchild skull didn't match anything from any species on Earth that was in this database. And then they also did, I'm not quite sure how this works, but they did a spectrophotometer reading, which is where you shine a light through the dissolved DNA, and you then take a spectrograph of the results. And this is used as a technique for measuring the purity of the DNA to see what other chemicals are mixed up with it. And typically this is the sort you would get with a normal human sample, but this profile was obtained from the Starchild DNA reading. So you can see that overall you've got a dip, and then rising to a peak, and then down to a trough again, and here a dip, rising to a smaller peak, and then down to a trough again. So overall it's similar, but again it's not characteristic of human. So only females pass along mitochondrial DNA because their eggs are so much larger than a male sperm. That's why they've got more DNA passed across. Now, the next thing they retested was the human mitochondrial DNA side of things. Now, mitochondrial DNA is circular in design and maintains astonishing efficiency. In other words, only about 5% is junk, and that does nothing important to critical to its functioning. 15 primary genes are very well understood in human DNA. 2 encode for ribonucleic acid, that's RNA, and 13 handle proteins. Mitochondrial DNA is extremely highly conserved. It undergoes so little change over time that those changes are used as the standard for a biological clock. In other words, how many generations this sample has gone through of reproduction, it can be used as a biological clock because there's not much mutation, very little variation, only small variations. So if you look at haplogroups in mitochondrial DNA, you'll see these sorts of sequences, AT, ATA, CCG, GCA, etc. And you can see these various sequences compared with the various haplogroups which differ slightly. You can see that mostly they're the same. I haven't done them sort of line by line. So each mitochondrion is always the same size. Imagine tiny golf balls floating in a cell's jelly-like cytoplasm, each exactly like every other one in the person in whom it is found. Other people might have different other alignments in the base pairs of their mtDNA, but those differences are so slight, many humans carry the same MT bases, many others carry it in their haplogroups. Haplogroups were created to classify large groups possessing similar mitochondrial DNA. In most cases, they are within the 33 shown at left. So you've got all these groups have been classified in the human groups. In other words, the top sort of 8/10 or 9/10 of this table, that's all human mitochondrial groups in different groups that have been found. Now, with them, we've got the Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA here, and there are some differences along here, not all shown on this diagram. But also, we've got these other things called Denisovans. What is the Denisova? Well, the Denisovans, they were actually discovered in 2010. They seem to have been related to Neanderthals, but they found this little piece of bone and a little piece of tooth, and they tested the DNA of this, and the DNA was just different enough, or was different enough, to show that the Denisovans, this is just a sort of a guess at what they might have looked like. They were a different species of human. They seem to have been contemporaries of the Neanderthals, and their DNA exists up to 5% level in modern Micronesians, Fijians and New Guineans, Australian Aborigines, and new groups are being found on a regular basis. So 5% of their DNA has been passed to modern humans, but they are distinct from Neanderthals. They are a distinct species. That's why they gave them a new name. So based on looking at the differences, we're sort of comparing the things that we've got that are not human, but are close to human. And if you look at mutations in mitochondrial DNA, you'll get within the human species about 120 in this, I think, the 16,000 base pairs. And in Neanderthal, you get 200 differences to humans, to Homo sapiens. With the Denisovans, you get 385 differences. And based on what they recovered from the Starchild's mitochondrial DNA, which was retested in 2010, they projected that the overall differences in mitochondrial DNA would be 800 to 1,000 base pairs. So it looks as if the Starchild mitochondrial DNA will be 700% different from humans. 700% different in the mitochondrial DNA. That, if you add up all the numbers and do the statistical sort of scaling up for percentages, and these are all the figures at the bottom here, like 1,583 is 9.5% of 16,569 base pairs, and if you scale that up, then you get this variation of 700%. So the mitochondrial DNA, though initially in 2003 it seemed to be human, with more detail being found, more base pairs being recovered with the 2010 test, no, this wasn't human mitochondrial DNA. That's what made the difference. Then in 2012, this was about, the talk that I've got a DVD of here I recorded. Lloyd goes through this in probably a bit more detail than I can. But they discovered the FOXP2 gene. Now this, in every human embryo, there is the gene called the fork head BOXP2, or the FOXP2 gene. It's just a different name for it. It's a master gene which controls the embryonic growth in at least 300 other crucial genes. It's like a control center gene for the other genes. The FOXP2 gene has 2,594 base pairs. It is one of the most highly conserved genes in our bodies. Changes in it almost never happen. In every normal human, the 2,594 FOXP2 base pair sequence is exactly the same. Everyone on the planet has the same FOXP2 gene. Now, what happened was a 211 base pair fragment of the Starchild's FOXP2 gene is compared to the exact same 211 base pairs in the FOXP2 gene in a human. And several other species of animals were also compared. The Starchild's 211 base pair fragment has 56 variations. 211 is 8% of the 250. In other words, they recovered 8% of the FOXP2 gene of the Starchild. And so 211 is 8% of the 2,594. And so in the total, if you extrapolate that, that's 8% out of 100%. So again, 700 Starchild variations would be in the full FOXP2 gene. And if you compare this to other animals, if we compare the same section from a rhesus monkey's FOXP2, only 2 of its 211 base pairs would vary from the human. If it were a mouse, it would be 20, a dog 27, an elephant 21, an opossum 21, a xenopus, a kind of frog, 26. So dogs and frogs are the most different at 27 and 26 base pairs respectively. To put this into perspective, let's imagine that when alive, the Starchild was indeed some unknown humanoid. No matter how different from humans it might have been to be in the humanoid family, its FOXP2 gene would have to be in the range of 1 or 2, or at most 3 base pair variations from human, as it was with monkeys. To go past 5 or 10 will put it into another class of species. 20 to 25 will put it in the range of mice and elephants and dogs. To have 56 is to put it into another realm, another dimension entirely. It's utterly unique. There is nothing that has a FOXP2 gene like the Starchild, yet resembles a human. So, in the Starchild skull, we find 16 amino acid variations in this fragment, which, despite all those differences, unmistakably resembles the human FOXP2, yet it demonstrates a coding pattern that is wildly different from all species shown above. So that's an astounding contrast. Now, this was another coding sequence that was found to be important because they found a collagen-like protein fragment identified by a collagen pattern search. A human fragment sequence is shown in blue. The collagen characteristics of the GLY glycine is pink. Note that the amount of proline in association with the glycine has a special meaning. So they found this collagen type which was specific to a particular thing, which is this. They found a sequence of specific protein, and this is related to glycine or proline pattern in the previous fragment, resembles the pattern of collagen 8, a protein found largely in the corneal endothelium of human eyes. So it looks like it had some sort of similarity to human eyes. And there was some coding that was found for making eye protein. That's what that sequence was all about. Okay, so that's some of it. There is more than that, but clearly, I haven't got time to go through all of it. So the comment from the geneticist, this guy who was doing this research, was a kind of skunk works. He had the permission of his company to do it. He did it as sort of back room, after work, after hours, using the equipment, and he got permission to do it. But the company didn't want their name revealed. He didn't want his name revealed, still doesn't apparently. The probability that such a highly specific arrangement of changes in a small fragment could have occurred by accumulation of sequencing errors is extremely low, if not close to zero. Nor could this arrangement have occurred due to contamination with the DNA of any known species. So in other words, if this DNA was contaminated with human DNA or other DNA, it should have shown more matches in the tests. But it didn't, it showed less matches, which works against contamination. From this evidence, one may conclude that the underlying biochemistry of the entity's life form must be either the same as or highly similar to humans or other species. Yet, the use of the genetic code, which still remains universal, is distinctively different, implying that this life form is very likely the result of a markedly variant and non-intersecting evolutionary process, which is another way of saying it ain't from round here. So, the skeptics and debunkers will say that no experts have gone on record to talk about the Starchild skull. This is also not true. 10 experts who studied the skull officially state that the Starchild is not a known deformity. They may not say it's an alien, I'm not saying that, but they say it's not a known deformity. It's not hydrocephaly, it's not progeria, it's not any of these other similar conditions which you might name. It is not a known deformity. And that's the list of them: Dr. Fred Smith, Dr. David. I won't read them all out. They're all on the website. So I often get asked this, because I think originally I didn't have this slide. What did the Starchild look like? Well, here's some speculation. This was done by a forensic sculptor, Bill Munns, for one of the documentaries that were made either for the History Channel or it was the Ancient Aliens. I can't remember which one this was made for. So in this, you can sort of see as it's made up, this is him building it up. To get this eyeballs to actually fit, he had to cut them in half. He had to cut the eyeballs in half because the sockets are so shallow. So that gives you an idea that this, what it might have looked at in kind of a vaguely human form if it had human eyes. But we've already cast a lot of doubt on that. And then the other thing which Lloyd used to talk about, he didn't do so much in later presentations, was the alien abductee type thing and the way that people had described seeing aliens, and having a triangular face and so forth. And this sculpture was made it was commissioned by a lawyer who had abduction experiences for a number of years, and he got a look at these abductors, and they looked like this. And he got the sculptor to tune this sculpture, and basically till it looked like what abducted him. And it's got a small lower face and a larger upper head. So again, Lloyd thought this was something similar to what the Starchild might have looked like. And this was another one that was done by Rob Roy Menzies, where he used the X-ray, a sort of quite clever idea, added on the lower face, and then tried to make up something which looked vaguely, similar to fit the shape of the human skull. And that's what he came up with. And the final result that Lloyd worked with him, for several months to get the final result, Rob Roy Menzies, and I think that's possibly getting close to what the being may have looked like. This, of course, is the skull from Communion, Whitley Strieber's book, but this was a stylized version of what Whitley Strieber had actually described from his abduction experiences. Whitley Strieber's a whole other story. I'm not sure about him at all. So there we have the cover of Communion, and and here's the Starchild on the right, or a suggested version of what it might have looked like. And then perhaps these shapes are closer still to what the Starchild may have looked like when it was living. This picture on the left, particularly with the thin neck and the long thin fingers, this actually is a well-known picture. It's called the Amoco alien. It was used, I think, in 1980 for Amoco oil, talking about the technology that Amoco oil had, that it was so far in advance that maybe these guys, wanted to take hold of it. But this is alleged to have been a leaked picture from Area 51 or some other such place where they're alleged to have people, alien sort of bodies, basically. And some people said this was actually a real image, but I don't know. There is a story behind that, and that story is told by Bill Cooper. There's an audio about that. And this was another picture that Lloyd showed a few times. This is a book by David W. Chase, where he basically just went round. He talked to people who said they'd had abduction experiences, got their stories, got their descriptions. He just wrote it all down, made sketches, and published it as a book. He didn't sort of try and judge whether they were true, not true, He just drew what they told him. And this is the guide to alien beings. And this is perhaps what the Starchild again may have looked like, with this sort of long drawn-out face and a higher dome skull. Okay, so we'll just quickly look at the Zealand skull and the Peruvian skull and the Paracas skulls. I think I've got a slide for here. Lloyd often said in interviews that he became Weird Skull Central. So because the Starchild skull is reasonably well known on the web, there's quite a lot of websites which mention it. He used to get all kinds of skull images sent to him, such as there's one he sent me which actually looked like it didn't even look like a skull. It looked like something from a Triceratops. It was very strange. He didn't know what that was. But the Paracas skulls, the cone heads, they should be studied like the Starchild. These can't really be human. In other words, I'll come on to that on the next slide. Lloyd was able to tell often at a glance whether some of these skull photos were a Photoshop job. The next one I'm going to show you is probably a model, I think. I don't think it's a real skull. He kept focus on the Starchild skull. He didn't try and go off into all the weird other skulls because he knew that this was a real physical specimen that had been tested and everything. So that was much clearer. This is one of the Paracas skulls from Peru. You can go and see these in a museum. People will try and claim that this is the result of head binding. Head binding cannot increase the volume of the human skull. It can only change the shape of it. So you're still stuck with basically around 1,300 cranial capacity. This is 3,000. 3,000, this skull. What the hell is it? They have been DNA tested, but I don't think to the extent that the Starchild skull has. What are these skulls? And there are various places they found these around the earth. I'm not an expert on these. I think there are probably other talks you can find on YouTube specifically about these skulls. These high dome skulls, 3,000 cc cranial capacity. What's that about? Quite a few in South America. Now, this Zealand skull, this came out 2007. The story of the Zealand skull is quite a recent one. The skull was discovered only in 2007 in the small town of Olstik on the Danish island of Zealand. The man who discovered it was a contractor who was hired to replace an aging sewer pipe on a property. The initial discovery was taken with a pinch of salt and somehow considered to be the skull of a horse. A former owner of the property was actually a horse butcher, and equine bones were known to have been buried in the rear garden. It was only when the skull was cleaned off, when it was fully discovered, what a find it had potential to be. So if you look at this, I think this is probably a model, the way that this slots together with the teeth and this sort of shiny effect here. It was claimed to have been tested at the Niels Bohr Institute. I couldn't find any evidence that that was true. No evidence of official media about. There was no news stories about this. I couldn't find that. But there was nobody around to debunk it either, which is also slightly odd. But I think basically that skull is just a model, and there's a story being put out about it, and that's about it. And then Brian Foster, he claimed that he discovered another skull in Peru. You can see he's holding it in his hand here. It's rather smaller. It's probably about a third or half the size of the Starchild skull, and you can see right away it's not symmetric. It is not symmetric. You can see it bulges at this side more than at this. These bones are not properly fused compared to the Starchild here. Strong. This is brittle bone. The eye sockets look sort of familiar, but this could indeed be more in line with a progeria victim. This is probably a fetal progeria victim or an infant progeria victim, I would say. And again, somewhat similar, but the bone is thinner and more brittle, and the suture lines suggest that it's not that of an adult. And you can see again how small this is here, suggesting indeed that it's an infant, less than half the size of the Starchild. The eye sockets kind of look deeper, but again, this is a much smaller skull, and you can see bits have been sellotaped on. So, and this is the same skull as well. Very small. You can see the hand there. And human fetal skull, for example, looks much more similar to this skull. So it's probably a human fetal skull, maybe with something like progeria, possibly hydrocephaly. Okay, so that's just, again, there are other weird skulls. I haven't covered them all. Starchild research status. Well, there's basically been no new information since 2012. Matthew Brownstein was a Tampa businessman. He built a partnership with Amy Vickers, Lloyd Pye, and Ray and Melanie Young. Amy's looked after the website for many years. I do know Amy. I haven't seen her for quite a few years, for about 10 years, but I do know her. We've kept in touch. And a crowdfunding campaign was launched in 2013, and these replica skulls were created. I did mean to bring this along with me tonight, but I forgot. But no new testing has been done, and emails stopped in April 2014. Lloyd Pye died in 2013, and Melanie Young, who's the owner, has done some talks, but I've got some rather disturbing news about that, which I'll tell you about in a moment. It seems that all the UFO people who want physical evidence of aliens, not interested. They don't really talk about this. It may get the odd mention, but if you go to various UFO websites, you don't see the Starchild skull mentioned very often at all, not compared to the number of websites for UFOs that there are. Now, I had a statement in January this year when I was giving this talk at another venue. Amy was Lloyd's wife, and she said that this was not an official Starchild project line, but she said in November 2016 the Starchild project was dissolved at the request of skull owner Melanie Young. Melanie became frustrated with the slow progress since Lloyd's death and believed she would have more success on her own. All former members of the Starchild project have no part in any current or future work on the Starchild skull and have no information on testing status that is not publicly available. And in several interviews, and I learned more about this, as I say, last week, she has reported that she's teamed up with this woman called Chase Klutsky with the intention of starting a new investigation. And they've actually now just published some more DNA results. They've published DNA results which essentially repeat what was done in 2003, 14 years ago. They've done a new test which confirms the results from 2003. But strangely, there was a very strange interview broadcast last week, which I listened to on a program called Veritas. Anyone familiar with Veritas Radio in the room? And basically in this interview, something very strange has happened to Melanie Young, because in 2014 she delivered a talk very similar to the one that I've shown you, because the source of the information is all the same. Much of it has been talked about since the year 2000, 17 years. But in the interview last week, she actually said in the interview she can no longer rule out the skull being that of a hydrocephalic. That's what she said in the interview last week. Even though I played an audio clip of her from 2009 saying that she had ruled out hydrocephaly due to her knowledge of a neonatal nurse. Now, over the weekend, I actually wrote a 5,000-word article going through this peculiar interview And I basically think that something very odd has happened to this woman. Because, as I say, Lloyd Pye died. Some people think he was the cancer was given to him deliberately in 2013. And so something very strange has happened to her. If you read the whole article and listen to the whole interview and then compare this interview with what she was saying at a lecture in 2014, it's like worlds apart. Something has clearly happened to this woman, and I place a date on that of probably January 2016. It appears something happened to her in January 2016. It will take a bit too long for me to go through all the details, but it could well be that we don't see much of the Starchild skull again. I think this Chase Kuletsky woman, who has connections to the US military, may have taken the skull, and it may have gone out of Melanie's hands. That's just speculation on my part. So what you're seeing now may be all that you ever see, potentially. But my summary and conclusions, I don't think this can possibly be human. It's not even close. You've seen that there's numerous physical comparisons that establish well beyond any reasonable doubt that the Starchild skull is radically different from all human skulls. There's dozens of physical differences, many of them quite remarkable, make no impression on the vast majority of mainstream scientists. They won't look at it. You saw one example of that tonight, and there are many others. They insist that each of its differences could have resulted from natural deformities, and indeed, Melanie Young in this latest interview more or less says the same thing, even though she's contradicted that in previous presentations that she's given. And it was her that wanted to find the answers in 1999. So there's no contradictory evidence is sufficient to force them to change their confirmed expert opinions. You've looked at physical appearance and morphology, dentition, X-rays, brain casts, bone chemistry, mitochondrial DNA, nuclear DNA tests, partial. None of those classes of evidence show that this thing is human. It's not even close. So if you want my opinion, this is the skull of an alien being that lived 900 years ago. Why it was here, don't know. I don't think it could have developed here. It didn't evolve here, certainly. Somehow it lived here, so maybe it did breathe our air. Maybe it had some special breathing apparatus. We just don't know. It is different to Homo sapiens, Neanderthal, and so forth. It actually seems to match the descriptions of certain types of alien beings that have been described by thousands of people around the world. Then we have the idea that it may have communicated telepathically. Admittedly, the evidence that I've shown you for that is pretty slim, but nevertheless, I think it's significant. So again, why have you not heard about this? Why aren't the UFO and ET community holding this up? Why didn't they help to pay for more DNA tests? So that's basically it. If you want to find out more, you can go to my website to read the article I did. I'd like to thank you for listening to The Bitter End. I'm on YouTube, I'm on Facebook. You can contact me through the website, anybody that wants to have further information and links to follow this up. And I'd like to say thank you very much for listening. That's the end.